Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Well, one thing I'll add to that, I don't know if you were setting me up for it, but I'm just going to assume you were.
Of course I was.
I'm going to assume you're that good.
This is like our 51st episode, so yeah, I am that good.
I think it's 52, isn't it? I don't know. It's too many to keep up with.
Yeah, I mean, we've been at this right at a year, so it makes sense.
Yeah, coming up on it. Well, if y'all are tired of us doing it and you want us to hang our hat, just let us know. I don't want to do that. I'm having too much fun with it.
He's just seeking affirmation. He wants listeners to reach out and tell him how good it is.
No, we haven't heard from that many people that want us to hang our head up. So if there are any, I think it's warranted to hear from them.
Now's your time.
Why are you listening? This okay. So what was I saying here?
They're just hate listening to us.
They need some fodder.
Yeah.
For around the campfire, I guess. Yeah. So, during my master's research, the intent of it was to look at how you could manage forest stands up on hardwoods in eastern Tennessee in various ways to affect deer and turkey habitat quality. And one of the things that became really evident to me that's related to what you were just saying is we were burning in a lot of those stands many times over again. Some of them have been 5 or 10 times over the years. And a lot of those oaks that were retained in the overstory are just hunky-dory.
Mm-hmm.
There's no evidence whatsoever of any damage.
Yeah.
There are some that have been damaged, but by and large, that seems to be associated with what you just said, where we've gone in and killed some trees and a big old limb fell down next to one of them and it caught on fire and it held the fire next to the cambium for a long duration, right, and that damaged the tree. So, with some precaution, you can avoid that. If you are intending to get fire in it, don't think that you necessarily have to put all these trees at risk, that they're your prized oaks. Often. So the damage that we were seeing in that, and that's consistent with the literature on the subject. There's been quite a few studies about burning and up on hardwoods.
Yeah,
and we documented. That's very consistent.
Yeah, we documented scorch in that study. We did too. And,
with water oaks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it was we did it across all oaks, but, most of our oaks in that system were water oaks.
Mm-hmm.
And we used this scorch classification system that ranges from 0 to 4. And basically 3 and 4, levels 3 and 4 are what you don't want. That's where you scorch. Level 3 is where you scorch the bark to where you've basically changed the surface characteristics of it. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not, you haven't just blackened it, but the typical pattern of the bark has been altered by the fire. And then 4 is basically where you're cracking the bark open and you're seeing like down into the cambium because it got so hot. And we had 0% of the trees that we tracked in that category 4. Only 5% of the trees that we tracked were in that category 3. They were all water oaks. So you would expect that, for that thin bark species. But a combined, what was it? About 80, 80 something percent of our trees were in category 0, 1, or 2, which is just superficial light scorching or moderate scorching,
Hmm.
where you've blackened the bark, but it still retains all of its original textural characteristics.
Yeah.
Um, so in um, that study, I was there, not for all of the burns, but several of the burns. And in most cases, we're burning during the dormant season on a day that, our flame heights weren't exceeding a foot, maybe a foot and a half.
Hmm.
Very laid back, low key fire. Oftentimes, it goes out in spots and you have to go back and relight it. And I'm not saying that you have to make it that low intensity, but, don't you can't get away with what you can get away with in pines in hardwood
Right.
systems. You don't want to have 5 or 6 foot flames ripping through there.
Yeah. When I can hear it, there are a few folks sitting in our audience right now thinking, well, a lot of the damage you can't see it, and then it's going to affect the quality of the wood at harvest. I
Hmm.
always hear some foresters bring that up. In fact, uh, I was where was I at? I was in Pennsylvania talking at a prescribed fire council meeting, I think, and I was talking about burning in hardwoods, and I got a lot of that kind of stuff. So, as it does in typical fashion for me, it spawned me to do a literature review on this subject. So, I figured while we were on it, maybe I would cover some of that. I had an article that I wrote about it in Quality Whitetails a couple of years ago, but it was in response to the audience from
Hmm.
that talk, and they were worried that burning in hardwoods was going to cost people a lot of money, like they were going to lose timber value.
Right.
Uh, you don't seem very excited about this topic. Would you like me to
No.
go on?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm following along, trying not to trip
Okay.
you up. I feel like I've been interrupting you all day.
Yeah. No, no, not at all. You're just having friendly conversation. That's all.
Never mind. Go ahead.
So, I actually did that article with Jordan Nanny, who I think you know him.
Yeah.
He's another student in Craig Harper's lab, so we were lab mates. Not at the same time, but same lab. Anyway, he and I put that article together because he at the time was working as a wildlife forester, and he was burning in hardwoods all the time, and he was
Hmm.
really interested and super knowledgeable about this. So we went through the literature and tried to figure out is what does the data look like on burning and up on hardwood stands.
Right.
And particularly, we were interested in long term experiments over a large spatial scale where they're burning relatively frequently and then at some point harvested timber down the road to see if it affected the value.
Hmm.
So I'm going to talk about Mann et al. Because I think it was one of the best studies on this. And it was published in 2020 because it was 139 stands. They were somewhere between 10 and 50 acres, pretty typical of what people are managing on private lands. And they had anywhere from 1 to 6 fires, depending on how long the stand had been receiving fire. And I think it
Hmm.
was a 3 to 5 year interval generally uh, on those stands. I can't remember those details, but we'll link it so you can look at it if you want to. Uh, what they found, they were looking at the volume of timber harvested from the burn compared to
Hmm.
if it had not been, and they on average saw about a 3% loss to the butt log.
Hmm.
So after many fires, long term, that was consistent with Marshall et al. 2014, Weidenbach and Schuler 2014, Stannis et al. 2019, Day and Schweitzer 2018.
Hmm.
Bunch of studies on this. All of them kind of settle in at that same 1 to 3%,
Yeah.
right?
So
So
can you translate it this way? So if it's on average, you had a 100 foot tall tree, because I like simple math. We like simple math
yeah,
here on Wild Turkey Science, right?
no.
Um, if you
I
had
did
a,
notice that you threw in a unique measure earlier, and I didn't say anything. I didn't want to stump you.
oh, did
You see what I did right there?
I?
You said there were a lot of them or something, but you emphasized that measure that
Yeah.
was just some.
Well, I appreciate you butting in.
Oh man, the dad jokes.
So if you had on average 100-foot tree, you're talking about having to cut a foot to 3 feet off the bottom of it, and that's what you've lost. Can you
Roughly, yes.
can you
No,
can you?
no, it was yeah. Some of them are 3% lost to the butt log.
Oh,
Just the 16 foot.
okay, I got you.
Uh, so, but some of them, you're right. I think it was based on the whole tree volume too.
Okay.
Anyway, somewhere in the 1 to 3%. Even let's just say that's the whole tree volume that you'd get
Yeah.
from the harvest. Uh, the worst case, there were some sites that they had 10% loss,
Mm-hmm.
and it was kind of interesting because Jordan and I were going back and forth on this, and I was like, "No, Jordan, you don't understand. Those particular sites were oak savanna restoration sites. Their
Yeah.
objective of using fire was to kill the overstory,
Yeah.
and they got 10% damage on average out of that when they were
Yeah.
trying to kill it. So we did some math on this, and we said, okay, let's pretend like you go through worst case scenario. The fire gets away from you, it gets too hot, you kill, damage some trees, you lose 10% over that 10-year period. Well, he went through and found some stand stock table information at the time and worked out how much value does that carry to the landowner. It works out in worst case scenario. Now, this is not what you do most of the time. You'd get, in fact, I'd say most of the time you'd probably get virtually no damage
Mm-hmm.
because this was Forest Service lands and they were probably burning fairly hot, based on my experience with those guys, compared to what the average landowner might do.
Right.
That is really afraid to lose any trees. So it's probably not going to be even what the average was in this study. But let's just say it was worst case, and if fire got away from you, what would you lose? It was about $84 per acre.
Mm-hmm.
So then we did some math for quality whitetails. We kind of equated that to deer, and we used my master study, Lashley et al. 2011, the data on what you could expect in the vegetation response in the understory to quantify how much protein would be produced from the
Mm-hmm.
fire if you thinned it to half and then lost all that wood from burning it frequently. What's the cost per pound? And that is if you actually pay to have someone else do the fire lines and prescribe burning for you.
Yeah. Right.
So all those costs, and we calculated that over a 10-year period, and let's see, it worked out to about 9 cents per pound of protein produced, or 4 cents per pound if we are talking about that thinned context, because you're going to actually harvest some of the trees that would have been part of your 3% loss.
Right.
So about 4 cents per pound to plant a cowpea food plot. That's about 13 cents per pound
Yeah.
that we do every year. And nobody bats an eye at that.
Sounds
But
like a pretty good deal to me.
you don't even get out of it the other things you'd get in the burning the woods. Supplemental feeding, $2.50 per pound of protein.
Yeah. There you go.
A lot of people don't even bat an eye at doing that. So the whole point of all of that is, can you damage your oaks? Absolutely. Can we take some precautions to prevent it and almost eliminate it? Yes. And even in the case that you are damaging some, it's probably still worth it financially compared to some of the other things that people don't bat an eye at doing.
Yeah. And anecdotally, I like to share with my students too that we've got a we've got a pine woodland out on our demonstration forest that has been burned annually for the past 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And as you can imagine, being burned annually, it's got, the understory is primarily grass, so it burns pretty quick and hot. And there's a number of, fairly large retained water oaks throughout the stand, and even some black cherries and things like that. And several of those water oaks, in fact, you can see through them because they've had, so much damage damage by
Yeah.
fire at the bowl. And again, we're not considering those oaks the way we're burning the stand. That's not an
Hmm.
objective.
Well, and
Um,
also, like, that isn't a fire adapted oak that I'd be thinking of in this
yeah, right.
context. Like
But
white oaks and chestnut oaks and
right, but
southern
what
red oak and all those would.
the point that I make to the students though is this is absolutely a worst case scenario for this tree, right?
Hmm.
And there's several of them that still produce acorns.
Yeah. Still
Isn't that
just kicking it.
something? Isn't
Yeah.
that something though?
Yeah.
I mean, you can see right through the bottom of it. There's a couple of them you could reach. I could reach my arm through and grab somebody on the other side of it.
Yeah. I took a picture of a student uh, last week. With she wanted the picture, but she got inside the bole of a tree that had been damaged by fire, and it was still producing acorns just fine,
Yeah,
doing its
yeah,
thing. So, uh, anyway, I know there's always hesitation from people to add fire into it, but there's so many advantages, especially from a turkey management standpoint, that you might want to consider that and
hmm
really think through some of the barriers of why you haven't been.
yeah. And especially if you start thinking about implementing fire in hardwoods and you've never done it before, I don't want to. I don't want to tell people something that's going to make them burn in conditions that are hazardous, for any reason, including to the trees or to having jumps or things like that. But I will say that generally speaking, you need more drying time on hardwood stands in order to burn them. And I tend to burn hardwood stands in a lower humidity, higher wind condition oftentimes than I would burn a pine stand during, just because,
Hmm.
unless you've been burning that stand for a long time and it's like fairly open canopy moving from a woodland to more of a savanna and you've got a lot of fine fuel in the understory, it's not going to, unless you're in that situation, oftentimes they're not going to burn very hot, when it's mostly
Hmm.
leaf litter carrying the fire. So I tend to look for a little bit drier conditions than I would in a pine stand when I'm burning those areas. So you might be surprised at how the intensity of fire is almost self-limiting in a
Hmm.
lot of hardwood stands. Now, like I said, disclaimer: I have I have burnt some hardwood stands on days with RH in the mid to maybe low 20s, and that didn't
That
work
was the
very
number
well.
I thought of.
That didn't work out very well for various reasons that I won't go into.
Hmm.
So learn from my mistakes, and I mean, you might even get away with that if you just had a rain, a couple days prior. But just feel it out, ease into it slowly, and I think you'll find that it adds a whole new enjoyable aspect to burning. It adds another layer of enjoyment and kind of some challenges, if you will, if you
Hmm.
enjoy burning.
Yeah. Well, um, I feel like we've gotten sidetracked. Did you cover all of the silvicultural stuff that you wanted to?
No, we just talked about single tree.
We
we
didn't
meant
even
to
talk
get
about
into
Shelterwood.
Yeah, we meant to get into Shelterwood and then maybe talking about variable retention and we could even talk about group selection. But I guess we could include those in another episode or just point people to resources where they can read more about that. It's up to you.
I think unless you need to go right now, I think we ought to give some rundown on
Yeah, I'm good. All I got is on my schedule for tonight is trick or treating, and that don't start for a little while longer. So,
them. Why do you think I've been wearing this costume? I got ready before the show.
I was gonna ask you why you were
Do
wearing
you
that
know how many
outfit.
people just paused it and went to our YouTube channel to see?
I mean, it shows more skin than I would have went for, but
Yeah, you don't like my witch outfit? Yeah. So, well, I think we've got some time. Let's talk about some strategies and maybe a few thoughts on the advantages or disadvantages of them.
yeah. So, one other technique that you might consider, and I feel like the average landowner implements so it's a Shelterwood cut, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the average landowner in the South, especially, is more common in other parts of the country. Rarely would ever implement a Shelterwood cut, and I think that that's part of the reason that we currently have this problem where we have a decline in oak recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference in a shelter wood cut and what we've been talking about in terms of single tree selection is that you're harvesting the stand much more intensively down to just a handful, potentially even just a couple of seed trees per acre. And you're trying to time that cut to coincide with the period just after a abundance of acorns, a solid mass crop has been produced because that's your seed source, right? And then you harvest those poor producing trees, the non-oak trees, and you're trying to get sunlight back to the ground to allow those acorns to germinate and produce what we refer to as advanced regeneration. And so once you've got that advanced regeneration in place, so this whole process, from identifying the good producers to implementing the cut to getting the advanced regeneration may be a several year process.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, from a silvicultural perspective, once that advanced regeneration of oaks has been produced, then they'll come back again for a final harvest and remove the seed trees. And so essentially, it's an even age regeneration method. It just takes a little bit longer to do it than with a typical pine system where we cut out all the trees and we go
Mm-hmm.
back and we plant seedlings. So oftentimes that whole procedure is combined with the application of prescribed fire at specific time points along its implementation to help the oak seedlings have an advantage. And then once you have that oak regeneration in place, then you can pull fire out and allow those trees to mature for some period of time so that they become more
Mm-hmm.
fire tolerant. And then if you want to, you can reintroduce fire back into that system. But that being said, if you're just trying to manage the stand to provide or ensure long-term continuity of acorn production. So you're thinking about generationally down the road. I want my grandchildren, or probably more accurately, my great grandchildren, to enjoy this forest the way that I did in terms of the acorns that it produced and the wildlife populations that resulted from that. Then you don't even have to implement that final cut. You can leave
Mm-hmm.
those seed trees behind so that you retain that acorn production from those mature trees in place for the wildlife. You're starting your new cohort, your next generation of oak trees that are going to ensure that long term continuity of production. And you've added nesting and brooding cover to ground
Mm-hmm.
level.
Yep. Well, I think it's important to emphasize a point that you did multiple times through there that this is all objective driven. The silvicultural treatment, the system of Shelterwood harvest is with the objective to regenerate a new forest.
Yes. And if I were a landowner that was going to use a shelter wood with the objective of regenerating a new forest, I would make sure to work with a good forester to do this.
Yeah. So I think that's important. I'm glad you added it. So your objective, you may be implementing a treatment at harvest that's very similar to a shelter
Hmm.
would, but as soon as your objective isn't to establish that advanced regeneration of oaks so that you can then come in later down the road once it's established and remove those
Hmm.
parent trees, uh that actually doesn't fit into that, that semantically doesn't fit into that definition anymore,
Yeah.
but it still allows you to communicate with the people that are doing the harvesting, and then you just don't follow up
Yeah.
on that second cut,
Right.
right? So, and I'm glad you brought up the shelter wood with fire technique. That's actually one of the things that I evaluated as part of my master's research in Tennessee. We were looking at how, if we go in, we were removing roughly half of the trees in that shelter wood harvest,
Hmm.
and the idea, like you said, is they are sort of sheltering that advanced regeneration of providing seed, but also lighting conditions that and other micro site environmental conditions that favor that advanced regeneration.
Mm-hmm.
But then you add in fire. In our case, we were adding it in about 5 years after the harvest. And the idea is that shifts favor to a lot of these oaks that are pyrophytic compared to maples and all the other competing hardwoods
Yeah.
that you don't want.
And they're stronger
Poplars,
resprouters. They're stronger
yeah,
resprouters once they get top killed by that fire too.
right. So that's the idea is you're giving them a an edge over those other ones. But
Mm-hmm.
if you go in and just repeatedly implement fire, then you can perpetually keep that understory structure in a desirable structure for turkeys.
Mm-hmm.
If you go in and implement fire once, well, 5 years later, it's going to start getting pretty hairy, and you're
It's
going
gonna
to
be
start
dog hair
seeing,
thick.
yeah, you're going to start seeing a decline in turkey use to where it almost doesn't exist,
Mm-hmm.
just like it would in a clear cut in pine.
Yep.
So, that's I think important uh, for you to keep in your mind is what is your objective. Another thing that I think is important, I don't think that you touched on it, so I wanted to make sure that we did, is with a typical shelterwood harvest, when your objective is to regenerate a new forest, it's pretty important to kind of distribute your trees relatively evenly across the space available that you retain. And that's not necessarily the best strategy if you're trying to maximize acorn production while you do that. So, the shelter wood's often implemented without that being a primary determinant in which trees get left.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way that you could alter that, that harvest, where you have some trees that you want to be left, even though they might be some of your most valuable ones, or they might be one that you would take out because of the poor form in that initial cut. But if it's a really excellent producer, that might lead you to leave it instead.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind
Yeah.
of changes that, you can alter those choices, I guess. And just to remind people out there, you ultimately have the decision over what gets cut and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And make sure that you understand that, and that if you think through this, that you can really plan out that to maximize the success of the operation.
Yeah. Absolutely. Good stuff. The last one that I was going to mention was variable
Yeah,
retention harvest. And so variable retention harvest kind of combines aspects of single tree selection that we've already talked about, and another harvest strategy that we haven't talked about, which is group selection. And really, all group selection is patch clear cuts, right? So like,
yeah, really
oft,
small.
yeah, oftentimes like 1 to 2 acre clear cut patches that are interspersed within the area that you have implemented single tree selection for whatever objective. So oftentimes you go into the stand and you're using single tree selection to remove species of trees that are low value to you or your focal wildlife species, or to target some degree of canopy reduction or sunlight penetration. And then oftentimes as it's implemented, it is paired with a group selection cut on for about every like 10 to 20 acres, I think is kind of the typical range. But it
Hmm.
doesn't have to be necessarily that formulaic. What I like about variable retention harvest is more the trend, if you will, kind of the overall um, effect that it has on the landscape, which is that you have areas that are more close canopy and more mature adjacent to different forest age classes or stages of succession, so that you end up with a lot of what we refer to as horizontal diversity paired with interspersion. So that means that you just have, various ages and cover types throughout the acreage that you're managing, and
Hmm.
that they're well distributed throughout that acreage. So think
Yeah,
about it
so it's
this
like
way.
within the stand variability in both.
Exactly.
You could generate them across stands, which most people typically think of, but you can also accomplish it through variable retention within one stand.
Absolutely. And so the beauty of this, and that was a very simple overview that I'm sure you'll want to expand on, but just to kind of, you know, go ahead and share with people what the objectives or the positive outcomes of that particular harvest technique might be for turkeys, is you can think about it or envision an area where I've got this patch of several acres over here that has a really good, stand of mixed white and northern red oaks all in a group. It's just
Mm-hmm.
a oak dominated area of my property. And that's going to be an area where turkeys not only go to feed on acorns during the fall and winter, but they're going to, as we discussed in the last episode, take their broods there for the thermal cover that it provides during summertime. It's going to be a cooler area of the
Mm-hmm.
property. But just right over here, close by, you may have an area that you removed more, you just happen to have more low value for wildlife species. Like maybe you had a grove of sweet gums there that you removed. And so now that's become early successional vegetation that hopefully you're maintaining with fire so that you could potentially have that bugging cover, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or that nesting cover, depending on how recently it's been disturbed. And then you have a gradient of everything in between so that essentially turkeys can meet all of those seasonal and daily needs within the stand.
Yeah, it's the closest thing to being a all inclusive management strategy as you get, really.
Right.
It's I think that's an important aspect of it. One thing I was going to add, what we're really talking about is variability in the amount of sunlight penetrating to the forest floor
Hmm.
in different places within the stand.
Right.
Uh, when we were talking about the Shelterwood cut, or in a typical thinning operation, you might get, if you're trying to cut 50% of the canopy down, you'd end up, whether it was every other row or however you're doing that, you're trying to achieve under most circumstances a relatively even distribution of remaining trees. So this is kind of like the opposite of variable retention, right? You have a
Yeah.
ubiquitous amount of sunlight coming in regardless of where you're at.
Yeah.
And
It's kind of like
what
what people typically envision in like a pine plantation or like a fruit tree orchard or something like that.
yeah. So if what the reason I was bringing that up, if you come up with what an average basal area you want at the stand level, and let's just say it's going to be 50% because it's easy for me to uh, think with that number in mind. So basically, you're going to have 50% sunlight penetration to the forest floor, but that doesn't necessarily have to be evenly distributed. And if you combine a practice or a system like Shelterwood with the that other technique that we were talking about, where we're ranking trees and trying to
Hmm.
to release trees that have good potential for mass production. If when you combine those things, I have seen this done a couple of times. One time really well. It ultimately sort of works out to a a variable retention type of stand dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was kind
So
of getting at that with the stand situation I described earlier, where
yeah,
naturally you have some areas where you want to retain more trees and other areas where you
right,
want to
right.
retain fewer. So it kind of sorts itself out.
Yeah, from a composition standpoint, certainly that generates the variable retention like you were talking about. And I was just
Right.
adding the other thing, like even within a species, if you're selecting good producers, well, they won't be evenly distributed over the stand.
Sure.
There'll often be a clump of really good white oaks over here, and then you got a clump of white oaks that are all poor over there, and you end up with that same sort of uneven distribution of light penetration that you're looking for with that strategy when you
Right.
start to layer in some of these other strategies with it. So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I've got one more question for you.
okay. It's not how do you say that. I had a joke actually. You didn't notice earlier that I didn't. Well, maybe you did, and you didn't say anything. Did you notice that I didn't say the name of the we're going to call it the Yale Harvard author?
I did notice that you didn't say the name.
Well, I thought it would be funny if I held it to the end and then tried to say it.
Go ahead.
Budgesquicks. Budgewicks. Maybe it's Budgewicks. I think there's a bunch of letters that are
I was gonna say that I hope
there's
that
a lot of
person is not one of our listeners.
Michael,
But
if you're listening, I apologize.
how
Or maybe
many?
Mitchell, actually. It's a really uncommon uh, association of letters in both names.
But
For me,
I was gonna say we're probably pretty safe. I don't imagine we have many Ivy League listeners.
maybe not. I don't know.
It's possible, but
But it's BOGDZIEWICZ. So
I
say
recognize
that.
some of those letters. So I did more serious on a
There's
more
some
serious
silent
note.
letters. I'm sorry, I haven't moved past this yet.
Do I need to give you a minute?
The Z's are silent. That's what it is. Yeah, I'm just really bad at this. I apologize.
Can't they just take them out of there if
is,
they're silent? I mean,
I was just thinking about Step Brothers. Have you seen that movie?
of course.
He's talking about the Pan Pam dilemma. He's like, oh, I see the N is silent. It's like there's no N in there. Oh man.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So all right.
What's your question?
One silvicultural technique we haven't even talked about yet in the context of hardwoods is clear cutting. When
Mhm.
would you? Can you tell me a scenario where you would consider clear cutting some hardwoods within a turkey management context?
If I am trying to devote some space to early succession, that's a quick way to get there.
Yeah.
I think that's one. One thing we didn't talk about from my master's work was a technique called at the time we were calling it wildlife retention cut, and it essentially is just we went in and killed all the trees that we would have cut, and
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of simulating a condition if you were in a stand that's been high graded, and all the stuff that's left is basically not merchantable, and
Yeah.
you could end up in situations where you just don't have any good stuff in it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
I've seen a
I
lot
think,
of those stands. In fact, I mean, they're
yeah,
common.
well, it wasn't that long ago in history where a lot of stands got high graded and
Yeah.
all the good stuff got cut out, and you're left with a bunch of hackberry and just stuff that you don't.
Just volunteer pine and stuff like that.
Yeah, like stuff that aren't necessarily the most desirable. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean you can't manage the structure of those stands to be really desirable for turkeys. But
Right.
from a timber production standpoint, we have a lot of them that are fairly undesirable. So that it may have a place there.
Yeah.
Another thing, it may be easier for you to move wood if some of it is clear cut,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
So some circumstances, it may behoove you to add that in to the
Yeah.
mix in some of the places.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you could easily envision a situation where a landowner has 100 acres that's all closed canopy hardwood, and maybe they implement selectively some few acre clear cuts here and there to diversify the property, and then they roll into that sale. They have the logger going in and removing some of those less valuable species of trees, or your poor producers if you've marked those trees, and make sure that they get enough volume on the truck so that they can make it worth their while and they actually bid on the job.
yeah. So take that as an opportunity to create early succession, or maybe you want to put in a food plot, or there's different reasons. I think the better question, or not the better question, the one statement I'd like to make about that is I kind of get this impression sometimes from some people that they don't know there's a different option than clear cutting.
Yeah.
Like they think of harvest timber and what's in their head is clear cut. And
Yeah, and I think that that's probably especially true for us down here in the South.
yeah.
There's probably a lot more familiarity among foresters with shelterwood harvest as you move further north from here and get into
Yeah.
some more of those hardwood dominated markets.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, but I definitely interact with people in pine and hardwood systems that kind of view that as the end point harvest and that we're going to start over, and not necessarily thinking about it of, oh, we can repeatedly go back into these stands as needed and maintain mature
Hmm.
overstory trees for
Yeah.
long duration. You don't
Right.
necessarily have to start over,
Yeah.
and there can be a lot of value in doing
It's
that.
kind of a beautiful thing.
Oh yeah, I've seen some pine stands that have been managed that way for a long, long duration,
Yeah.
and they're 20, 30, 40 basal area, and they're burned frequently. And man, it's some of the most beautiful territory you've ever stepped in.
Yeah.
The trees you can't reach around.
I know.
So, okay, well, we probably didn't cover everything we needed to there, but I think we did a pretty good rundown. I feel like we kind of glossed over some of the silviculture, so maybe we ought to pick some of that up
We did.
next episode.
If there's anything in particular that we left out, specifically from like an implementation perspective,
Mm,
like if you're a landowner listening to this and you're trying to figure out how to do this on your land and there's gaps that you wish we would have addressed, shoot us a message and we'll think about trying to address those. If not in their own episode, in another maybe like clarification at the
hmm
beginning of our next episode if it's on another topic.
Yeah. I mean, we spent a large portion of this one clarifying one
Yeah.
from last
But I
one.
think people will appreciate that because we're showing that we're trying to interact with our audience and
Yeah,
respond to
yeah,
their
for sure.
feedback.
I agree. One quick thing related to your point you just made. The other thing is there's a lot of folks out there that are actively helping landowners, you're professionals in the field, and
Yes.
same thing goes with you. If you have common recommendations or comments on strategies or things you want us to share, please reach out and let us know.
Yeah. Yep. We absolutely appreciate that. Um, so can I share something with you that's unhardwood related, but definitely turkey related? And I guess I should say share it with you and the two remaining people who are probably listening at this point.
Yep, go for it.
I got a text message literally while we were recording just now, from the landowner who owns the club that I'm a part of now, and it was
Hmm.
a picture. And let me back up for a second to provide context. This landowner is doing almost everything under the sun imaginable to try to provide high quality turkey habitat on his property. Just has beautiful managed, pine plantations. There's a big power line right away that runs through it that's been managed for early succession. Lots of spraying, lots of burning, all those things. And some of those efforts can be undone just like that. And the case in point, this picture that he sent was where the power company had come through and they just seeded ryegrass along our right of way.
Mm,
And I wanted to bring that up because bigger picture, those practices are things that we need to try to figure out a way to stop. The seeding of ryegrass and of Sericea lespedeza, I still see it everywhere, just still actively being planted. And
we
there
don't
have
have
to be
time for me to respond to this.
there
This is
there
so
have to
frustrating to
be
me.
better alternatives that we can get on contractors' approved list of erosion control plants.
Yeah, or
Um,
removed from, like, there's a suite of plants that at least if we could get those removed.
yeah. So just seeing that, it just burns me up
Dang.
because, you think about all the time, effort, and energy he's put into getting that property where it is today. And then all it takes is a power company tractor coming through just broadcasting ryegrass. And it's like
Here we are again.
one of the other club members texted back and said, yeah, we need to make sure to send them our clethodim bill next year.
Well, maybe we have some folks from the power company listening. Please take ryegrass off the list.
Thank you. I don't think we have that kind of clout yet, but
Well,
this is an award-winning podcast, but it's only won one award. So
I thought we were going to You just got to keep bringing that up. I thought we were going to close on a positive note. Now you got me stewing about ryegrass.
Sorry. I had to get that off my
Golly.
chest.
I know. All right. Well, as always, thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate you. Take time to rate it if you hadn't already. You guys are the reason we're here and the reason this thing's been successful, and we're planning to keep going. So thanks for all the support. I've been really having fun with it.
Yeah, thank y'all. And that was a nice long one, hopefully, for some of you that are probably burning up the miles on the road right now, traveling to hunt, hopefully, and enjoy some new and fun places. So,
well, or if they're like me and they're going to be driving a truck with a trailer behind it full of trick-or-treaters on the trailer, you can listen while you're trick-or-treating.
To drown out the noises of the children screaming.
All right. We'll see y'all later. Right. Appreciate it.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.